Ah, home sweet home. You know, I've been thinking, specifically, I've been thinking about Silent Hill. It's one of the most famous horror series in video games, with a cultural cachet that really only Resident Evil can claim to surpass. It's one of the most discussed and debated series in video game history, and yet it's also one with something approaching an actual cultural consensus. We all love the spooky town shrouded in fog, the surreal monsters and those banging tunes. But we also know that there are good Silent Hill games, and then there's the other ones. We all know the story. Team Silent disbanded, and a cavalcade of mismatched Western developers took up their torch, producing a collection of games that would eventually outnumber the original Japanese efforts, and would generally be looked upon, at best, as a mishandling and misunderstanding of the original games, and, at worst, as an outright desecration of their memory. The details will change from person to person, obviously. Most of us have one game that we say, oh, you know, this one, actually, this wasn't too bad. And one that was like, oh, holy Jesus Christ, get that shit away from me, oh god, my eyes, oh god. But not once have I ever seen someone try to seriously claim that Silent Hill was improved by its transition to the West. Even in the infinite kaleidoscope of opinions offered to us by the internet, no one seems to seriously argue that Silent Hill Homecoming is better than Silent Hill 2. There is one game in the series, though, that kind of sits in defiance of this binary dichotomy. It belongs to neither the immense critical acclaim of Team Silent's original classics, but neither to the overwhelming derision of many of the games that follow them. It sits uncomfortably in the middle, between this world and another. What happens when members of the original Silent Hill team set out to make a game that is so different from the originals, both in gameplay, tone, and even in the style of horror, that it could almost be considered a completely different series? Let's find out as we enter the room.
On the sidewalk, on the city, on the streets, just no whisper. Busy people going nowhere, see me soaking the rain. Feel the passion, nothing matters. My resistance is waiting, like a flower in the basement, waiting for a lonely day.
Released in 2004 to the most unenthusiastic critical reception a Silent Hill game had received to date, Silent Hill 4 grasped the title of Series Black Sheep enthusiastically the instant it left the womb. After 3 games that all followed roughly the same gameplay formula and controls, The Room was designed from the ground up to be different, with producers Akira Yamaoka and Akihiro Imamura saying they wanted to make sweeping changes and give players something new and fresh. In the context of that mission statement, Silent Hill 4's design can only be considered an enormous success. Silent Hill 4 is such a break from the conventions of the series that it makes the long-standing rumour that it wasn't originally intended to be a Silent Hill game at all feel completely plausible.
Frankly, I think it was a necessary step. Familiarity breeds contempt, as they say, but more than that, it breeds comfort, safety. A comfortable set of mechanics to slip into is arguably anathema to creating an effective horror atmosphere. Coupling this with... Look, I love Silent Hill 3, but sometimes it leans a bit too heavily on Silent Hill 1 stuff for my liking. So Silent Hill 4 set out to change things, shake things up a little, and it sure as hell did that. Silent Hill 4 is ultimately a very, very different game from its predecessors, from top to bottom. And this, combined with some arguably questionable design decisions, landed the game with a pretty mixed reputation when it first hit. However, I wouldn't be here if I wasn't about to tell you that it was actually pretty dope, so let's start at the beginning.
Room 203 is the centerpiece of Silent Hill 4, duh, and it's a masterstroke. So much careful design consideration has gone into the player's relationship with this place, and the familiarity you build with these 3 rooms of this slightly run-down, embarrassing one-bedroom apartment is part of why the game works so well. The room contains the game's only save point, the only place where you can effectively manage your inventory, and you'll need to understand how the room works in order to solve much of the game's puzzles. Through the mechanics, you're practically forced to come to see this room as your home. And what makes that better is how much Team Silent resisted the temptation to make it an overtly horrifying location. Instead, they lean into the mundane. It's not a cubist haunted apartment, at least on the surface. It's just kind of normal, simple. It's bad because it's a crummy, shitty apartment. The kind we can relate to, honestly, rather than being cartoonishly sinister. Well, except for one aspect. Henry Townshend, the main protagonist of Silent Hill 4, is locked in his own apartment, from the inside. Nothing he can do can remove those chains from the wall, kept where they are by a force beyond his understanding. No one can hear his cries, no one can see him at his window, and every attempt to call for help fails. And there we have our hook. Being trapped in your own house, unable to leave, is a unique flavour of horror we don't often get to see. More common is the horror of other places, the horror of the unfamiliar, of being trapped somewhere belonging to an other. Places with unfamiliar, unconventional laws that we are unable to comprehend. At first, there's nothing even truly terrifying about Room 203 other than the idea of being trapped inside it. Like I said, it's basically just a shitty apartment. You just can't leave. Well, not directly anyway. Through creative means, you'll be able to leave the room to explore the other worlds. These dreamlike environments are where the majority of the game takes place, and unlike previous games in the series, which tended to offer a slightly more open, or at least meandering, approach to level design, Silent Hill 4 offers a linear succession of locations, each one a kind of twisted take on an everyday environment that you traverse through mostly straightforwardly, before using holes in the wall to duck back to the room to save, manage your inventory, and check on the various goings-on of Room 203. You can only leave the other worlds by going back to Room 203, and you can only leave the room by facing the other worlds. Clearly, this is not a permanent solution to Henry's problem. To find that permanent solution, you'll have to explore, solve puzzles, fight monsters, and, most frighteningly of all, encounter seemingly normal people who, routinely, become the victims of violent killings as part of a ritual called the 21 Sacraments. And at the centre of it all is Walter Sullivan, a mysterious, supposedly dead, serial killer.
Despite Henry being the player character, it's actually Walter that is the real main character of the story, which focuses the majority of its runtime on developing his character and his motivations. Even the symbolism is mostly based on Walter. The monsters are representations of his victims, his fears and biases. By contrast, Henry is kind of ancillary to the plot, little more than a window through which we see all of this. It's tempting to call this a flaw, to say that Henry's weak relation to the plot makes him a weak protagonist, but I don't think that's the case. I think it's integral to what this story is trying to say, in fact. And what that story is trying to say is just as eloquent as Silent Hills 1, 2, or 3. In fact, I think Silent Hill 4 is just as accomplished in the narrative department as any of those titles. Put a pin in that one.
When you get control of Henry for the first time in the other worlds, you start walking around and look at that. No more tank controls. Henry controls, by and large, like any other video game hero. He runs in the direction you point the stick and even fights with a degree of competency not seen in previous protagonists of the series. Gone are the days of slowly walking up to a ghoul and frantically swinging a 2x4. Henry can lock onto enemies, charge his attacks, strafe, swap weapons without pausing the game, and even dodge. By the standards of previous Silent Hill heroes, he might as well be Dante.
Savage! 6 skills!
Now, normally, improving a game's combat system like this, or even adding a combat system where one barely existed previously, would be universally considered an improvement. However, that isn't quite the case with horror games. Vulnerability, tension, fear, these are all far more important emotions to the experience than the traditional loop of challenge and triumph. Most genuinely scary horror games either severely limit or outright remove the ability for the player to fight back against the horrors, because the vulnerability this creates is inherently scarier than feeling you can triumph over your foes with ease. It's why Resident Evil 4, despite using a lot of horror tropes and visuals, is never really properly scary, because Leon is so capable of dealing with the threats in his way. Improving the combat system like Silent Hill 4 does is actually potentially damaging to the experience of playing a horror game. Thankfully, Silent Hill 4 is aware of this and implements a few things to maintain the feeling of helplessness and vulnerability. Animations are sticky and imprecise, emphasizing Henry's discomfort with the situation and unfamiliarity with combat. When you fully charge your meter, Henry swings wildly, feeling like he isn't even in control of his own swing, and some weapons are visibly too heavy for him to use effectively. While Henry does feel more competent than Heather or Harry, for instance, he's still basically a normal dude. You never exactly feel like you're going to go all Doom guy on these creature features. Also, Henry has one major drawback compared to his predecessors: his pockets. Gone is the effectively unlimited inventory space of prior Silent Hill games. Henry can hold 10 things at once, and no more. Like the classic Resident Evil series, Henry must manage his inventory carefully, choosing which of his essential items, ammunition, health kits, and melee weapons he needs to get through the next section. This system is genius, for much the same reasons it's great in Resident Evil. Limiting the player's inventory forces them to make choices about what they want to give up and what they need to take. You can load up on healing items, sure, but that's taking up space that may be better used for ammo and weapons. You can take a gun and a lot of bullets, but that's room that may be better used by items that help you against the game's more esoteric monsters. Fill your inventory with items and then find you need to pick up some in order to progress? Well, looks like you've got a potentially dangerous trip back to the room on your hands. And of course, you'll need multiple spaces in your inventory filled with certain items in order to solve a puzzle and progress sometimes. It's basically impossible to cover all your bases completely at once, and as a result, you'll usually be carrying around some kind of vulnerability, whether it's low ammo, low health, or only a single melee weapon. The Silent Hill 4 difference is that instead of frequenting various save rooms located at strategic points around the maps, like in Resident Evil, although you can get back to room 302 from multiple places, you'll always be going back to that same place every time you want to mess with your inventory, which is something that deepens both the player's relationship with and dependence on the room. Combat itself is also a little bit tougher than it was in prior titles, with enemies coming at you in greater numbers than ever before, particularly in the late game, which has no qualms about swarming you with very tough enemies. All of this together makes for a more eminently playable game that accomplishes accessibility without sacrificing horror. It remains a challenging, tense game, maybe the most mechanically intense game of the series up to that point, and the fact that it achieved this whilst also making the game more engaging to play is hugely impressive. Even Silent Hill's infamous puzzles are better here. The game has less puzzle solving than past entries, but I think the logic in those puzzles in this game is much better than some of the screamers in the past few entries.
What?
The puzzles, generally speaking, utilise sensible, understandable logical through lines, and play more upon the player's familiarity with the world design rather than late 90s Sierra adventure game thinking that the original games were more than a little guilty of indulging in. For example, there's this one puzzle in the forest area that I really like. You can't leave an area while carrying a specific item that you need to progress, so how do you get out? You go back to the room, put it in the box, leave the room, enter the room from another hole, get the item out of the box, and now you're in a location where you can use the item instead of being blocked off. I actually got a little satisfied aha out of solving this, as opposed to puzzles in past entries which tended to just leave me frustrated by the end. The second half of the game tends to be what loses people, and I can see why. You journey back through the game again in the same order, only with more dangerous ghosts that follow you throughout the level, and you're constantly chased by a nigh invulnerable serial killer, and you have to escort a character whose personal defensive capability is limited, and for whom damage can permanently impact the ending in a negative way. All of this sounds pretty bad, I grant you, but honestly, I get a real kick out of it. I generally do appreciate backtracking in games when it's done well. I love building up relationships with areas and games over spending long periods of time in them. It's part of the reason why I love Metroidvania so much, and revisiting these levels that you already feel like you've mastered with extra stressful elements to keep you on edge is a great twist, and puts you in a unique role where you feel confident enough in what you're doing to be genuinely protective of your escort, but still on edge enough that you can never really relax. As frustrating as Eileen's pathfinding and AI can be at times, it's impossible to deny that trying to keep her safe whilst managing a rapidly diminishing collection of healing items is a brilliant inversion of the common problem so many horror games face in their second half, where you become so inundated with healing items and ammo and weapons that the game just isn't tense anymore. Plus, this surreal spiral staircase descent into hell that frames it all, ooh, that's hot.
So then, if I think all of this works, then why does the game not connect with people in the same way that Silent Hills 1, 2 or 3 did? Well, I think it's really just because of how different Silent Hill 4 is, in both the big obvious ways and the more subtle, harder to put your finger on ones. Silent Hill 4 is not really scary in the same way the others are. It preys on different emotions and different fears. Fears that many players may not really be able to relate to. Gone are the primal images of Silent Hill, or the deep dives into the masculine and the feminine that define Silent Hills 2 and 3. Silent Hill 4 is something different, something far more ambitious. It's reaching out through the screen and into your head.
Opening Silent Hill 4 in the first-person perspective is as strong a mission statement as one could ask for. It draws the player into its world directly, forces them to be a participant in its horror in a way they have never been in the series before. The game's construction of the relationship between the player and the player character is communicated in its entirety through this one scene. Consider the first-person camera. It's a direct line feed for the player into the game world. It implicitly casts the player as the protagonist, rather than simply having them control the protagonist. In Half-Life, you aren't playing Gordon Freeman. Not properly. Gordon Freeman doesn't even really exist. He is your vessel into the game world, a comfortable pair of shoes to slip into and nothing more. By contrast, third-person games put the player at somewhat of a distance from the game world by having them puppeteer an established character with their own motivations and personality. Leon S. Kennedy is his own man, separate from the player, because really, no one else could come up with sick burns on his level.
I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
There's a clear separation here. You can see that you're not in the game, someone else is. You're just helping them along on that journey. Now, obviously, there are games that split the difference and blend elements of either, but I think, taken on their own, this is what these techniques convey. This is the perspective that Silent Hill has traditionally taken up. You, as the player, guide the protagonist through their trials without ever truly becoming them. Silent Hill 2 put particular emphasis on the distance between the player and James Sunderland, but all three of the original games did this to a certain extent. This is different. Henry is different. He is the other kind of protagonist, one that serves as a vessel for the player themselves. Unlike his predecessors, he doesn't have a dark past, a personal trauma, an emotional reason for him to undergo the trials he's facing. He barely even has a personality. He is, like Gordon Freeman before him, a vessel for the player first, and a character second. Yes, you control him in third person for much of the game, but the fact that these first person sequences exist at all, and that they do take up a substantial part of the game, is telling. To underline this point, you aren't even controlling Henry in the opening, but another character entirely. You can take control of another character, one with a different backstory and motivation, and it doesn't matter. These characters don't matter. You are the one that matters. Henry Townshend isn't the protagonist of Silent Hill 4. You are. Normally I wouldn't talk about this for so long, but it's important here. See, the central gimmick of Silent Hill as a series is that the titular town will twist and contort itself to better mess with its inhabitants. Silent Hill 1's Ghoul Gallery was lifted from Cheryl/Alessa's subconscious. Silent Hill 2's town was expertly twisted around the guilt of James Sunderland, and Silent Hill 3's monsters preyed upon fears of childbirth and sexual assault. Obviously, this is an oversimplification, but the pattern is clear. Silent Hill creates its world to scare the protagonist. So then, what does it mean when the protagonist is not James, or Heather, or Harry, but you, the player? Well, it has to craft its labyrinth around what it thinks will scare you, what it thinks will get under your skin.
So, what does Silent Hill 4 think I'm afraid of? Well, it's this. The outside. Other places that I don't have full control of. Places that I might not feel entirely safe in. Places with other people.
The environments are the most mundane scene in the series yet, set entirely outside of Silent Hill, though you can see the town in one area, and for the most part not using the kind of industrial hellscape that Silent Hill's Otherworld most often deploys. The places you explore in this game are, for the most part, just kind of places. A subway station that looks pretty much like a subway station. A forest that's basically just a forest. While obviously these places are nightmarish in their own way, their twists are far less extreme than in other games in the series, and plays more on the idea that these places are already scary and intimidating places to be even before Silent Hill's influence rolls in. Look at the monsters in the subway station. Stray dogs, hands reaching out to touch you when you're just trying to get past them. The water prison world, the most outwardly surreal location in the game, preys on the fear of being watched in its level design and notes. The building world is a wonderful mix of the mundane and the surreal, heightening the already creepy reality of a city neighbourhood at night. The apartment world may be the only area of the game to truly leverage the classic Otherworld aesthetic, but even then, it finds its real scares in the feelings of natural paranoia and assumptions we make about what our neighbours get up to inside their homes. Maybe they keep umbilical cords in their cupboards. Just a just a totally random example there. Consider Walter Sullivan himself, the most human, developed, and relatable Silent Hill villain. Walter and the player are kind of two sides of the same coin in that way. He's part of the picture the game is painting, a painting that's more like a mirror the longer you stare into it. Obsessed with the arcane rituals of Silent Hills, traversing its worlds and making them his own, he is essentially a Silent Hill fan, draping himself in the imagery and lore of the franchise to give him power. And what is he trying to do? He's trying to reunite with his mother, who he believes to be incarnated in Room 203. Home and mother, these two primal images of comfort and safety, and Walter is trying to get them both in one. All he's wanted to be, ever since he was a child, was to be safe, to be with his mother forever and never be hurt by any of the myriad things he became terrified of as a child, from insects to other people, like the enemies in his other worlds. They're the most mundane enemy set ever seen in a Silent Hill game. Buzzing swarms of flies and stray dogs, and most frequently humanoid monsters, from the patients, the gumheads, and most of all, the ghosts, those whose very presence nearby is physically painful for you. In the fiction, in the world of the game, the symbolism of these monsters relates to Walter Sullivan, but beyond that level, they also relate to the player and what the game thinks might scare them. Walter's fears and his monsters are often not related to specific traumas like with Alessa and Fire, but they're painted with slightly more broad strokes, simpler, greater, more encompassing fears. Silent Hill 4's monster designs are all more effectively scary if you're basically already scared of insects or animals or other people. One of the bigger memes around this game is the burp sound that the patient monsters make when they're attacked, and I've seen a lot of people mock this and consider it just hilarious, but if you're someone who can be uncomfortable with the bodily movements of others, it is genuinely kind of a gross and unpleasant sound. And as one of those people, this does kind of skeeve me out, as comedic as it is to others.
Which kind of gets at the heart of the issue. The real reason why I think Silent Hill 4 just didn't engage as many people as Silent Hills 1, 2 or 3 did. The simple fact of the matter is, not everyone is gonna find this kind of stuff scary. Maybe not even most people. But as someone who does suffer from anxiety in these kinds of situations, Silent Hill 4 is a deeply creepy game. It's not a kind of leap out of your seat kind of scary, but it is the kind of fear that crawls under your fingernails without you noticing. The kind of fear that sits in your gut like a weight until you vomit. A kind of creeping sensation that won't go away no matter how many times you try to tell yourself that you're gonna be alright. The monsters prey on these fears, these kinds of feelings. Feelings that make me want to run away and go back home and never leave my room again.
Earlier, we touched on the fact that the titular room avoids the cliches associated with enclosed spaces in horror media. That's because it's not a prison in the traditional sense. It's not a cube-esque nightmare realm. If it's a cage, it's gilded, or maybe bronze, considering it's still a pretty crummy apartment. The comforts of home are all still here. As much as Room 302 is a prison for Henry and the player, it's also their refuge, their safe point. It's where they return to refresh and recharge. The game puts so much effort into forcing the player to develop a relationship with this place that is your prison. It becomes something you rely on, even as it traps you. You really develop this kind of twisted Stockholm syndrome with regards to Room 302. And that's the real horror of the place. Not the idea of you being trapped in your own apartment, but the idea that over time you can become used to it, accepting of it, maybe even dependent on it. It's a feeling that creeps up on you, that dawns on you without you being fully conscious of it. The real horror of Silent Hill 4's room is not the fear of being trapped somewhere you can't leave. It's the fear of becoming someone who doesn't want to leave. It preys upon a real social fear that can face anybody, but can also face people who play video games. It's a fear of your comfort and your prison becoming one and the same. In the same way that the monsters of Silent Hill 4 prey upon everyday social anxieties, the room represents a retreat from that. A place you can stay that feels like it won't hurt you, but will both prevent you from progressing and will eventually prove harmful. At the halfway point of the game, the ceiling fan falls, and with it, the illusion of safety the room brought you. The room is no longer a safe place. No longer a place where you can hide from the horrors of the outside world. Now those horrors have crawled back up the hole behind you. They infest the room, manifesting as hauntings that can be dispelled, but only with a limited, finite resource, ever dwindling each time you try to keep the encroaching darkness at bay. Not only is it a brilliantly executed subversion of the expectation set up by the first half of the game, turning the entire dynamic of it onto its head and proving once again that Team Silent were the masters of the horror long game, but it also represents the completion of the metaphor of the room. It is both your only comfort, your only respite, and also a place that you grow to resent and hate, and something that grows in turn to hurt you the longer your prison sentence lasts. I think it's significant that Walter Sullivan thinks that the room is his mother. Mother, at least in a sort of thematic, abstract, or even idealistic kind of way, is a source of comfort, of acceptance without judgment, and unconditional love that will also smother you. So too will the spaces you find comfort in if you are unable to live without them. Even outside the room, there are images of motherhood everywhere. From the way that Henry is born into the other worlds in the fetal position, to the umbilical cord worms that link together the various worlds, the concept of mother is constantly stalking the player and refusing to let go. Mother, as a concept, is something one has to reject in some way as they grow, or else they will remain stillborn, unable to grow, unable to move past childhood, just like Walter. When you finally find Walter at the end of the game, it's right behind a wall where the game began, a decomposing corpse hidden there long ago. Walter never left room 203, never left the comfort of what he thought was his mother's embrace. He ventured out through these video game worlds to torment others, but he remained inexorably trapped in a prison that he chose. A prison made of comforts, of home, of mother, of TV, of video games, of Silent Hill.
I've said before that The Room is a game that tries to look at what will scare you, someone who plays video games. And in order to do that, it had to make assumptions about the kind of person who plays video games. It had to turn the lens onto us. When Silent Hill looked at James, it made for him a nightmare labyrinth made of male sexuality gone out of control. But when it turned the lens on us, it crafted a story about shut-ins and social anxiety, because that's who it thought we were. That was what it thought would be our Silent Hill. And you know, maybe the fact that this game didn't engage with people in the same way that Silent Hills 1, 2, or 3 did, proves the game wrong. That we weren't the kind of lonely, introverted, anxious shut-ins it thought we were. That we weren't Walter Sullivan. That this was not our Silent Hill. But I'll tell you something. Once upon a time, it was my Silent Hill. And when you're in that town, there's only one way out.
Dancing alone again. The rain falls.
Silent Hill 4 is a remarkable game. It's creative, brilliantly realised, and very, very creepy. Whether you're a new player or you're giving this game another shot, I can't think of a better way to spend Halloween this year than to curl up with Silent Hill 4. Wait, what? What do you mean it's December?